Going to be live now.
Holy crap.
But you look so pretty, Dani.
You too.
Thank you.
Okay, the link is in the chat, so
All right.
feel free to share it with anyone and anywhere you want. I'm also sending it to each panelist personally, so feel free to share it on Facebook, on Twitter, or whatever. And don't forget to tag the conference or the group if at all possible. Okay. With that said, and we are at 35, Lucas, we good to go?
Yeah.
Okay, so you can take on from now. Thank you.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I hope you had a nice morning or a nice night of sleep and you are all fit for this panel today. It's the first discussion table of this day. We already had some presentations on STs. And today we are discussing medievalism and public history. And with us at this table, we have Paul Sturtevant. Did I pronounce it right?
Yes, you did, actually.
Thank you very much. And Daniele Galindo and Carolina Gual. So with no further blabbering from my side, I will extend to the panelists, and I will propose that we go in order from names order or alphabetical order. So Carolina, would you go first?
Sure. So good morning, everybody. Thank you all for being here on a Friday after already a couple of days of event. I know everybody's already becoming a bit tired, so thank you for your presence. Thank you also to Vinicius and Luis, especially for the invitation to be here with you today. And I know I have a very short time, so I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen and start, okay? So here we go. All right, so I am a professor at the Federal Rural University of Rio de Janeiro, and today I'm proposing this very quick talk with some thoughts based on this title that I am calling Whose Public History? A History of Women and for Women. The idea to think a little bit about this topic and discuss these issues came to me via Facebook when I saw a comment from a podcaster who is quite known in Brazil. His name is Iclis Rodrigues. He has a history podcast. And on his personal page, not his podcast page, he made a comment after he produced a video or a podcast, it's exactly, about women's rights to vote and the history of the women's right to vote. And he made a comment that he was very disappointed because this video had flopped, which in internet terms means it was not successful. It did not get the expected interaction or likes or views as other videos or podcasts that he had produced. And that got me thinking about what had happened. Why is it that this specific topic related to women's votes was not a success? And I decided to investigate a little bit the public. So are we considering who our public is, not just in terms of demographics in general, but the specific groups? And we can consider lots of different groups in that case. Today, I'm going to focus specifically on women as the public, as recipients of a form of public history. I could be talking about racial issues. I could be talking about the broader gender, LGBTQ communities, for example, but I've chosen specifically the case of women. And I begin with this quote by education specialist in the United States. She was one of the first experts to discuss gender bias in education. And she says, each time a girl opens a book and reads a womanless story, she learns she is worthless. And exploring that, what is the idea that is behind it is that many times women are not present in history. We know this has been discussed for many decades already, since already the turn of the 1960s with the feminist movement, gender studies. I'm not going to go into that, but it seems that there is still places to go, and public history, I believe, is one of them. But my focus initially is not really on women as the object, but in this case, the public. So the case with the comment that I mentioned was with a podcast. So I decided to see, well, who listens to podcasts? And we have some interesting numbers that I want to share with you. This is research, the pod research from the Brazilian Association of Podcasts. Yes, there is such a thing. And they do this research every 2 years. This is the last one that was released at the end of last year. And it contains the data actually for 2018 and 2019. The data for 2020 should probably be released at the end of this year or beginning of 2022, I imagine. So let's look at who is the public who listens to podcasts. And in 2018 in Brazil, it was 84% men, only 16% women, and other, which is people who have not really identified. We could imagine maybe non-binary, but we do not know. It's not actually zero, it's 0 point something, but the chart doesn't calculate that zero. So it's massively a masculine media. In 2019, well, we had a little bit of an improvement, 72% men, 27% women, 1% other, but still majorly male public. This is for podcasts in general. So I decided to look at podcasts for history specifically to see if something changed. And then I have the data exactly from the podcasts of Iclis Rodrigues that I mentioned. His podcast is called Leitura Obriga História. It's a play with words in Portuguese. Instead of saying obligatory reading, it's obliga history reading. That's the name a little bit. And these are the numbers that he supplied after he did research with his listeners. And look, the numbers are still pretty much the same. 69% men, 28% women. We have 3% not specified and a 0 point something for non-binary. So still a big divide. Well, let's take it a step further and let's see what happens when we look at not just a history podcast, but a medieval history podcast. And here I took as an example a podcast called Medievalism. It's not a huge, they don't have the same fan base, let's say, as Iclis's podcast, but still a significant one. And it's dedicated specifically to medieval history. And the numbers tend to maintain 60% men, 37% women, 2% not specified, 1% non-binary. So the question, of course, that is obvious is what is happening? Why is it that the public is in such a large part a male public? And we can ventilate hypotheses, and I'm just going to bring hypotheses here for you guys today, nothing beyond that. The first one, the more general answer, is that podcasts began in the past decade or so as a male-oriented format that was dominated, especially due to context specifically of games and things like that. So originally, the public was composed mostly of men, and that kind of stays stable throughout the years. Women have not adopted so much this as a way of being in contact with many different contents. But that doesn't fully answer, and I'm going to show you another more specific number related to this medieval history podcast called Medievalism. He made a series of episodes dedicated to women's history. In particular, two that have this title called Middle Ages, Age of Women, play with Georges Duby. Women's Views of the Middle Ages, 2 episodes. And look what happened. Episode 19, which is part 1, we have a pretty even distribution between men and women. 46% women, 45% men. The second episode, episode 20, part 2, we have an even more different composition, and suddenly women are ahead. We have 55% women, 42 men, 2% not specified, 1% non-binary. So this raises the issue, the second possibility as to why women listen or don't listen to podcasts, and we could say that it has to do with the topics and whether they feel represented in the topics that are being discussed. So here, when we have things specifically thinking about women's history, it seems the public is more involved. The female public is more involved. And there's a second element, and this is not really based, first, yes, this is numbers. One other thing that this podcast in particular does is ensure that female guests and presenters are there. So of a total of 23 episodes, 15 of them had either a co-host or a guest who was a woman. 7 of them were presented alone by the podcaster, who is a man. And in one of them, he had a guest who was a man. So almost only women guests. So here we have another element. It's not just the content, but maybe the fact that you also have women taking part actively in the production, in the interviews, in the presentation of the content also affects the public. And one more point to consider, because if we are thinking about reaching the different publics, we need to consider the vehicles we are choosing. So indicators show us that maybe podcasts are not the number one go-to in terms of reaching women. And then here we have something that has been given to me by the podcaster Bruno Rosa, and he says it's not really based on statistics because he doesn't have these numbers, but when it comes to the interaction of his public via Instagram, there's also a difference, and the women are much more participative. This possibly has to do with the fact that Instagram globally, we do not have specific data for Brazil, we just have the global numbers. It is globally divided pretty evenly between men and women. So it is expected that in Brazil, the same pattern is reproduced. And this is a pattern that comes much closer to reality in a sense, if we consider that we have at least a more balanced relationship here between men and women. So the question posed is, which vehicles to use, my answer is, depending on who your public is, you should consider different forms. Instagram might be more effective. We also know that Facebook, for example, has a more female-based user profile. So that could be something to consider when we are trying to do public history. To consider the different publics. And these numbers will probably change if we factor in other things like the racial composition or other elements to this analysis.
3 minutes.
All right. So the question then that we have is, okay, we're going to do this and we're going to reach women and we're going to have content for women, but which women's history? And we know that when we consider the culturally received perceptions of medieval women, a series of stereotypes are usually at play. And I mentioned here my co-panelist, Paul Sturtevant, and Amy Kaufman's book, The Devil's Historians, where they draw our attention to the fact that, for example, a mythologicized idea of chivalry is very present in the gender roles attributed to women in the Middle Ages by contemporary views. And what happens then is that one of the predominant images of women still shared is that of the damsel. Be this the damsel depicted in the pre-Raphaelites, which are not medievals, but have pretty much formed our image of what a damsel and a knight are, be it even when we try to subvert a little bit. In the case of Fiona, she didn't really need to be rescued, but she was being rescued. She was waiting to be rescued in the first movie. She gains a different role throughout the series. And this impacts even the perception that we have in the relationship between women and men. And we have then, in 1990, the movie Pretty Woman finishes with Richard Gere in his white horse, which is a limo, wearing his armor, which is a suit, and raising his umbrella as his sword or as his lance. It's still the image of the rescuing. He's rescuing the damsel, in this case a prostitute, through love. It's this image of chivalry in this woman that is still subject. The other image of women that appears associated to the Middle Ages is frequently the witch, that has been portrayed through Snow White and became the prototype of the witch. But even when we have more modern depictions like Melisandre in Game of Thrones, this more powerful woman, beautiful but dangerous. And even in these more feminist-oriented movies of movements of women who call themselves modern witches. So we still play with basically these stereotypes. And what I want to propose is that if we want to do public history of medieval women for today's women, then we need to consider a few points. First, we need to consider the form of communication. As I have said, what is the best vehicle? Second, we need to involve women in the production of content. And here I'm even thinking through Frisch's idea of shared authority, which is key to public history. And third, we need to break the gender stereotypes. If we want to be effective in reaching women today, we need also to break these gender stereotypes that are associated to the Middle Ages. And finally, I'm borrowing here from Mary Erler and Marianne Kowalowski, who advocate for gendering the narratives of the Middle Ages and subverting even periodizations that we have when we look at history through the lenses of women or of gender relations. So events or phenomena that have traditionally delimited or marked the study of the Middle Ages, when we factor in the gender issue, the place of women, many of these events, their meanings change, or their significance is sometimes even obscured by these processes. So just to finalize, if we want to make sure that we are reaching women, they need to be in the production and they need to identify, recognize themselves in the material that we are actually producing and sharing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carol. It was a great presentation. Now, I will quickly pass the speech to Daniele.
Yes, now. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to thank Vinicius Brega for the invitation and the other members of the session as well, Lucas, Carol, and Paul Sturtevant, for the chance to discuss medievalism, public history, and its implications for our present. Public history is nowadays a favorite topic among Brazilian scholars, and I see this as a potential problem. Some of them think of public history as showing their work on YouTube or any other social media. But do they think about how they access the audience? How can the topic be more approachable for anyone? I recognize the efforts to produce more accessible knowledge and how academia focus on their audiences outside the university in recent years. I remember here, hold on, Judith Herring's introduction to her book, Byzantium, telling the reader the story of how and why the book was made. She wrote it for workers at the university and for anyone interested in reading more about the Byzantine history. Her effort to speak to another audience unfamiliar with it made me think about my practice as a researcher and professor of medieval history and German literature. The proposal of funding a lab to gather undergraduate and graduate students to present and discuss medieval and medievalism content and research in social media was my way to expand the contributions to Brazilian society. The lab is called Poema, interdisciplinary nucleum or lab for medieval studies and antiquity. As other Brazilian groups that create content, such as Barbaridades Medievais, coordinated by Cláudia Bolvo, Medievalíssimo, Carol spoke about it, coordinated by Bruno Rosa, Meridianum, coordinated by Aline Dias, and Virtu, coordinated by Francisco. Poema invests in information on the disinformation. That means this construction of common sense truths and uses of the past. Dialoguing with common sense or misinformation, the group organizes weekly informational cards, for example, about instrumentalization of the past. I have here some examples. The Holy Grail and the never-ending search, Arminius and the foundation of the German Imperium, Deutsches Reich, stab in the back between the two world wars. The cards are organized a little bit like this, what we are talking about, how the thing happened, how we can see this use of the past. And at the end, we have a warning to the readers, such as watch out. Here, there is a problem that you can see in red. Fique atento a estes abusos do passado. Watch out for this abuse of the past. With the cards, we have also 1 hour live streams with Brazilian scholars. Here we have Lucas, for example, about problematic themes, such as barbarians, Vikings, witches, as Carol said also, and Medietic Middle Ages, for example. The new project of Poema is called Arthurian Café, Café Arthuriano, and it's led by Mauricio Albuquerque, a PhD candidate at the Pelotas Federal University. It's streamed on YouTube and thematizes media's products in a variety of discussions. For example, Märchen, fairy tales and Disneyfication, Game of Thrones and Orientalism, Tolkien and medievalism, and the next one will be about monarchy and myths. Despite more than 2,500 followers on Instagram, my main concern is who are those Poema followers. In this questioning, I realized that this kind of public discussion does not reach outside academia, but is still only reach outside academia, but is still only in a specific audience. I return to my initial question to think about this kind of approach. Do we think about how we access audience? How can the topic be more approachable by any audience? What I observed about the daily practice of Poema is that although we opened ourselves to a new audience, this is not enough. The workers, and as in Heron's case, are still outside. They do not consume what we produce. They read WhatsApp memes and truths, for example. In this sense, public history is not only about media, but more precisely about language. We still speak for those near and readily focus on those who believe in Freemasons and Knights Templar or other historical inaccuracies. Language is a powerful key to public history, and we should use it as a tool to reach those peoples. But then comes another question. Should we use a more accessible language, a problematic expression in itself, since, well, like many things inside the humanities, we really cannot measure how accessible something really is. And usually, when we do, it's through quantitative data only, views, likes, and subscriptions. Will the message we are trying to convey also suffer? In other terms, we need complex language to access complex topics. Can we, historians, really explain in accessible terms, for example, the different ways humans experience the passage of time and how time itself is created through human experience? Can we reconcile the demanding for quick and easy history or history of those in a hurry with method, sources, bibliography, and now the content of form, Boring, Hayden White, that make our work precisely what it is, history in a scientific and correct manner? I came to another point of discussion. Does public history mean good history per se? As Andrew Elliott on YouTube said, good historians can make bad history, and bad historians can make good history. In Brazil, take figures like Leandro Narlock, Politically Incorrect Guide of Brazilian History of Latin America of the World, and Felipe Castanhari, Political Guide, that's in History Channel, for example. Even though they make bad and inaccurate history, you, as a consumer, can well publicly and easily access it. And then again, if we access that, they are more popular because of views, likes, and subscriptions. We could also ignore the question I asked at the beginning of this essay. Who are those followers? History is a political effort, and we know who those bad, if not absolutely dubious figures I mentioned are, and more importantly, who they serve, for whom their history is most helpful. I cannot say for sure what I'm about to say, so I recognize in advance it could be perfect, not be true, but those figures most likely type 17 on election day in 2018. They helped to propagate fake news and mobilizing a better manner of Cuban history. They helped to elect the current president. In 2020, Narlock himself was fired from CNN in Brazil, a right-wing channel, for homophobic remarks. Not to mention the most critical aspect of this conversation, fake user, i.e. bots, a very well-known political tactic used by these groups to inflate approval and manufacture support. There are all other good examples of bad history among Brazilians scholars, groups that use histories as a self-promotion matter. They do bad history, although they are familiar with methods and theories because they misinterpret the sources. They read them on their own terms, ignoring, for example, the production context and choosing a 19th century naturalist positivist approach or and they use language in a dubious way. Can I talk with those guys? No, we cannot because they block us. It's impossible to read such groups. For example, here is historicity in series, for example. Series should be analyzed as media production, not as a historical occurrence. If it's right or wrong, should be interpreted in its own context, for example. And the next one, the next example is about Vikings, the capital invasion. Amy Kaufman talked about it in the last round table. And as you read the text, you think they are supporting those things. Just at the end of the blog post, we see they mention supremacists and white supremacists just at the end. That's a bad usage of language, I mean. As Andrea Elliott pointed out, bad history isn't shared because people trust the source. It's shared because it's useful. It's not useful because it's true. It's useful because it's usable. And finally, it's not usable because it's fixed to the facts. It's usable because it appeals to the facts the reader already thinks that he or she knows it. In other words, what I'm trying to point out with my thoughts on public history was already questioned by Eliot. How we might be able to stop people from using bad history. That drives me to think that shared authority, Carol spoke about it, Michael Frisch, 1990, could be an answer to access ordinary people. Even if our focus should lay on historical responsibility as a framework. Historical responsibility for me means combative and constant work on language and sharing contents to encourage anyone to become prosumers of their own critical thinking, as Eliot said. As you can see, my main practice on medievalism and public history lays on doing and thinking about it. I don't have certainty. I have my daily work on YouTube, on Instagram, in the street and classroom. I'm on my family and friends on combating those bad practice. And those are my personal thoughts on this subject. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniele, for your presentation. And now, please, Paul, you can start.
Hi, I'm Paul Sturdivant, and full disclosure, I am feeling a little bit nervous here and outdone because I did not come prepared with a speech or PowerPoint presentation like the other panelists did. But I do have some reflections on medievalism and public history, particularly my experience with both, some questions that I have going forward, and I think some of the big issues that at least I see in terms of what public history and the intersection of public history and medievalism, some of the issues that are at that intersection. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Paul Sturdivant. I am the editor-in-chief of The Public Medievalist. I was very pleased to hear Daniele talk about language and about the way that we can or can't use accessible language to talk to the public, because The Public Medievalist, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is an online publication that is specifically about trying to take good scholarly work, have scholars write in a way that is accessible and understandable and enjoyable by the widest possible public. And that means, in a lot of cases, altering language, something that I, as an editor, am pretty iron-fisted about from time to time, if anybody who's worked with me will know. But what you might not know about me so much is about my day job. My day job is actually at the Smithsonian Institution, which I love being able to say because it's something that's instantly recognizable to most people around the world. And the work that I do at the Smithsonian has nothing to do with the Middle Ages. In fact, if you go to the Smithsonian looking for medieval stuff, you're going to be very disappointed, and Lord knows I am all the time. But what I do is that I am a visitor research specialist. I am effectively a historian, sociologist, psychologist, sort of rolled into one. The way that I try to explain it to people is that we use social science methods like surveys, interviews, things like that, in order to help the institution better understand its visitors and make it a better place to work and a better place to visit. And I haven't actually talked about my Smithsonian work to medievalists very much at all, because, as I said, like, there's nothing medieval at the Smithsonian, and so I didn't necessarily feel that it was particularly relevant. But when talking about public history and medievalism, I feel like this is a rare opportunity for me to actually bring my two worlds together, because the thing that I do at the Smithsonian is that I look at audiences, I look at publics, and I work very hard to try to better understand who they are, what they want, how to reach them, how to teach them, how to change their minds, and the ways in which we ultimately can't change their minds. And that's incredibly relevant to this conversation that we're talking about right here. So some of the big things that I have learned from working with the public and for the public at the Smithsonian that I'd really like to impart here are, first of all, trying to think not just about the public, but about the publics. Think of them not as a monolith, but as a mosaic. I think that's something that Carolina was talking a little bit about when it was talking about the difference between men and women in terms of their consumption of history and in terms of their engagement with podcasts, for example. And that is absolutely something that we look at. But, and so when we look at the various publics, one of the natural ways that we tend to think of breaking people down we try to organize these patterns of people and these structures of people is through demographics, obviously men and women, or about race, or about sexuality, or about class, or about any of the other demographics that make up sort of who we are and the lives that we live through. But there are also a lot of other ways to look at people. And one thing that I have learned through my work at the Smithsonian that I really would love to impart is that not everyone is like you. This is something that I run up against all the time. This is something that Smithsonian designers, some of the smartest people, cleverest, most creative, innovative people I've ever met, have run up against major brick walls because they assume that everyone thinks like you, wants similar things, and is living a similar enough life to you that you can really understand them. And unfortunately, the really exciting thing about the work that I do is that that's just not true. to give you an example of the way that we try to still think about people in a way that we can understand while accepting this incredible diversity of the human experience, is through a model that one of my coworkers named Andy Pekarik came up with, that's called IPOP, I-P-O-P. IPOP is a way of trying to understand people's preferences when they come into a museum. So what kind of experiences they are expecting and what kind of experiences they prefer to have in a museum. And those experiences he breaks down into those 4 letters. So idea, people, object, and physical experiences, I-P-O-P, right? And so ideas are things that are big ideas, very conceptual, usually very textual. They're sort of classic scholarly academic sort of stuff. People, by contrast, are things that you engage with emotionally and empathetically. They are stories. They're stories of people, and they are the stories behind the objects or behind the events. They're the ways in which we connect to other people by relating to them on a more human level than a more intellectual level. Objects, the O, objects are those in museums are built on their objects in a lot of ways. And so object-oriented experiences are ones where people are looking very closely at a particular object to understand its aesthetics, or to have a touch with beauty, to really examine its details, to really understand its how it was made, when it was made, things along those lines. Stuff that a lot of curators are very, very focused on, but that not necessarily all the public is. And then physical. Physical is a very interesting thing. Physical is what happens when you put a group of 8th graders in a museum and you get 1/4 of them wanting to treat it like a playground, that they want to have these physically engaged experiences, that they are very interested in sports, and they're very interested in movement, and they're very interested in the embodied world, and that museums, unfortunately, are absolutely not prepared for that. And so because you are trying to fit this round peg of a excited, physically oriented child into the square hole of a museum where they're not allowed to touch anything, they're not allowed to move around, and they have to shut up and be quiet and read, that obviously doesn't work. And so that disconnect between what the museum is offering and what the people need is a big problem. And one of the things that I've been looking at in my work is about what I have tried to call hacking, which is effectively how people take the experiences they are given and try to turn them into the experiences that they want. So say, for example, that 8th grade child who's very precocious and full of energy and wants that physically embodied experience, how they're going to take the museum and they're going to use it in order to satisfy their needs. So they, for example, on a study that I did, I was observing these kids who were using the the escalators, who were running up and down the escalators and playing games on the escalators in a way that was ultimately, it was disruptive to the other museum goers, and it was frankly pretty unsafe. But they were doing this because the museum wasn't giving them what they need. They were doing this because they were taking this pretty banal device that a lot of us use all the time, and they were turning it into something meaningful for themselves that was helping them meet their needs. And so the question that I posed to the museum is, okay, are there ways in which you can, first of all, either meet their needs elsewhere, or where you can take the things that they're already doing and make them more safe, give them the opportunity to be able to engage with it in that way, to meet their needs, but do it in a way that is productive. Is there a way that you can put some kind of informational content and attach it to that? Is there a way that you can creatively hack your own museum to make it so that the people who are using it are able to get what they want, and you as the historian, the curator, the educator are able to get what you want as well? Because ultimately, if this doesn't work, it's not the audience's fault. it's the expert's fault, especially in a public history context. And so I want to pivot that to medievalism just a little bit. Because one of the things that I've found that I struggle with a lot is trying to find a way to reach wider and wider publics with the work that I do with the public medievalist. A lot of the way that we advertise the public medievalist, I mean, we don't actually pay for advertisements. We just put it out on social media like everybody else. And some articles do very well and some articles don't. And I find it's actually quite unpredictable which ones do and which ones don't. And I'm always scratching my head, particularly about several groups that I see on Facebook that have huge numbers of participants. So to give you an example, like there's a group called British Medieval History that has 30,000 members. There's a group called Medieval European History that has 22,000 members. I mean, we're talking pretty big numbers when it comes to people who are interested in the Middle Ages and medievalism. But if you look at the groups, they're like cesspools. They're terrible. They're full of the romanticized idea of the Middle Ages. They're full of casual sexism. They're full of, like, goes right up to the line of Islamophobia without crossing it as to get banned kind of thing. They're like, oh no, we're just going to post memes about Vlad the Impaler for like 40 days straight. But no, that's not anti-Muslim. Of course not. That's not what we're doing at all. It's absolutely what they're doing. And so the question that I have been scratching my head over as a public historian, as someone who is interested in publics and in audiences, is how can we make what we do more usable and more useful for the people who want to use it? And obviously, if people want to use it for creating a nationalist identity and finding reason to hate other people, like, I'm not interested in making it more useful for those folks. But I'm not talking about those folks. I do not believe that all 30,000 of the people in that group are like dyed-in-the-wool white supremacists. God, I hope. But the question then remains, is like, what can we do? Because we are the experts, we are the ones that are in charge here. How can we change our practices? How can we change what we do in order to make what we are doing into something that they can use, that they can find useful, that they can enjoy, so that they're not just 8th graders running top speed through a museum? That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Paul. It was very interesting to hear your experience. I was thinking here because our university actually holds a museum. Our local museum is held by the university. We actually have a colleague that is displaced from university duty to act as a museum director. And every 4 years we have to vote for a new colleague who is going away and take care of the museum. And these are some very interesting things, because it's not a big museum, it's a small museum for our small town, and we have an old steam engine, a locomotive, and two cars at the patio outside the museum. The museum is housed on the former train station at its downtown city. So the one big thing that I saw when I came first to the city and I went to the museum was a huge plate saying, do not touch the steam engine, do not climb on the steam engine. And the thing is that the steam engine is outside and people just do it. They want to take pictures with the steam engine. They want to climb on the rails and do their stuff. And I was always thinking, kind of like you said, if we want people to like history, to be interested with history, they need to be able to engage with history. And we just have to conduct that in a certain way that is safe, that they don't do stupid things like destroy the steam engine because it's very, very, very interesting what you said. So now we come to the part when we start discussing all these things, and I would like to invite questionings from the public, from each other, from you. If you have crossed questions you want to make, and if anyone has any question from the public, please either raise your hands or paste a question on the chat or to the Q&A. If you want to make a question in Portuguese and want me to translate it, I can do it, or either Luis can do it. And if you have any questions for Paul, Carol and Daniele would, I believe they understand Portuguese, so that would not be a problem. Please ask away.
I start asking Paul something, because you were talking about museums, Paul, and it's interesting because when I decided to investigate a little bit this idea of the focus specifically on women as public and public history, I found that there was very, very little literature about it. And most of what there is related to museums, in fact, and historical sites. So there are quite a few researchers considering this, how to introduce more of women's place in history into museums. And I was just wondering if you know of anything of this sort at the Smithsonian. Well, it's a huge institution, lots of museums actually, but if you had any thoughts on that.
Absolutely. First of all, importantly, hello to your dog. I hear he was saying hello to me.
It's actually my neighbor's dog.
To your neighbor's dog,
in the background, yeah. I have a cat who's not very happy about it.
I imagine not. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the literature, I mean, the discipline of public history, at least in the United States, has long been about public history institutions. So about and on public history institutions, so on historic sites, on archives, and on museums. That's thankfully changing and sort of expanding as people come to reckon with the fact that like the History Channel is also public history, whether we like it or not. But traditionally, that was like the core of public history, and so it kind of remains in the literature. In terms of the initiatives that are happening at the Smithsonian, yeah, there are a few initiatives that have been happening at the Smithsonian. There's been a women's history initiative that has been running for several years, and actually Congress, we're very pleased, has just approved funding for the first women's history museum at the Smithsonian, which, probably knowing how slow these things move, is probably going to be open in about a decade. But Congress approved funding for a Latino History Museum and a Women's History Museum sort of at the same time, which we're actually quite pleased about. And at first, actually, I was a little leery about this, the separation of history in this way. Because, for example, when the African American History and Culture Museum opened, which is the most recent museum, which we internally call it NAMAC, because it's National Museum of African American History and Culture, that I was at first a little skeptical, because I'm very much in favor of telling the African American story robustly within the Smithsonian, but I didn't want it to be sort of separated out. I wanted it to be part of the American History Museum, or like an annex to, or something else. But then I went to see it once it was open, and it changed my mind almost immediately, because it wasn't just about the museum itself, but it was also about the space. And talking with the visitors, as I did for my job, talking with the visitors, there was a real sense among the African American visitors that this is for us, this is ours. There was a real sense of ownership and pride. There was an idea that this is telling our story in a way that we can be proud of, and that this is a space that we can be proud of. And that sort of changed my mind on a dime, because, yeah, theoretically, like, not separating out history might be the better way intellectually, but in terms of how people engage with it and the meanings that they make and get out of history, that was remarkable. And so then going back to your question about women's history, I think very much the same thing could be said about women's history. And to some degree, women's history is history, that with the women's experiences are, you know, women have been over 50% of the population for as long as humans have been humans. And so the idea that women have to be the sort of asterisk of history that sort of spun out, rather than say men's history being the one that spun out, feels wrong. But on the other hand, it's women have been marginalized and denigrated in our society. They've been underrepresented in our histories. They've been underrepresented in our museums. Even to this day, at the Smithsonian, most of the mid-level people at the Smithsonian are women. Most of the leadership are men. It's still something that we deal with to this day. And so I'm absolutely full-throatedly for it, even though it's one of those things that at first I thought it was something that I didn't want to be necessary, but now I think it's actually a really great thing that they're doing. So
Thanks.
Any more questions?
So can I throw one at Daniele then?
Please.
Well, it's something because we have been talking about this outside of the symposium. This idea of the simplification of the language, which is, have you given further thought to that as whether it is possible to really, I don't know, maybe break down the complex ideas that we want to convey in order to actually maybe use simpler language and still get to the public? Because your question, it's almost like I would say an unsolvable question in a way, because if we assume that the only way to express complex historical ideas is through a complex language, then we just give up, right? So there needs to be a way of doing it, and I'm here thinking if it could be, if a way could be maybe to first break down the ideas and then bring them back together. I don't know. Just wanted to see if you have more thoughts on that.
Oh, it's
sorry for that.
It's a trap. Okay. With the cards, we've tried a lot to simplify language with keywords, with common sense, or deconstructing common sense, for example. But it's really hard because when you simplify something, you go in danger. You can also repeat what you criticize in other like memes or political appropriations, for example. I don't know how to solve it. Maybe Paul has an answer because he has a outstanding blog. Maybe.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I have the answer. I'd love to know. This is one of those things where I do what I do, and I've gotten good feedback from some folks, but I'm always happy to get more feedback as well. I do think that it is possible. I mean, I don't know if it's possible, but I think it's necessary. So we have to try, you know? I think that when it comes to explaining complex ideas, it is very hard. I am not going to lie about that. It is very hard to do. And it's particularly hard for scholars to do because we have the curse of knowledge. We have the vocabulary that we've built up over time that allows us to express and play with certain ideas. And then when we're asked to like aggressively unlearn that or forget that it can be extremely disconcerting for people. And speaking frankly, as I've, over my editorial career, such as it is, I've run up against a few people who simply don't want to do that, who simply don't want to speak in words that, that a first-year undergrad could understand. But I think that we have to find some way. We have to do this struggle. We have to do the work if we want to be public historians. Because, yeah, and I'm always railing against the idea of having to dumb down what we do. One, because of the ableist connotations of the word dumb, but two, because the public isn't dumb. The public isn't dumb at all. The public can be very intelligent indeed. They just don't know our language. They know other languages, like the language of engineering or the language of theoretical physics or the language of library sciences or whatever. And in a lot of cases, they're not really willing to do the work of learning our language because they've got other things to do, to be honest. Who has the time? Yeah, and so I find that the approach that I encourage with a lot of the writers in the public medievalist who are struggling with this is that I say a lot of the time when we are having difficulty expressing these complex ideas, it's because we are looking at like one piece of bark on one tree in the forest, rather than, and that the public can understand that piece of bark. They can understand why it's interesting. They can understand why it's fascinating. But you first need to do the work of telling them, okay, there's a forest, it looks like this. Then there's this tree and it looks like this, and this is why it's interesting. And then if we scope even down further, this is the piece of bark and this is why it's really, really, really interesting. And then scope back out and say, and that's how this is meaningful to this forest, which is then meaningful to you in some way, meaningful in your life in some way. So it's about doing that telescoping in and telescoping out process through the course of an essay to take people along with you on the journey. Because if you just throw them in at the deep end, then that's not being a public historian, that's being like a historian in the public. That's being a person who's being a historian just within earshot of people, and that I don't find is very successful. So.
Okay, we have one question from Claudia Bovo to Carolina. And I'll read in Portuguese and then I'll translate so Paul can understand what's going on.
Thank you.
Quando você apresentou o quadro da diferença da interação feminina nas mídias, eu me perguntei os diferentes apelos que as mídias fazem ao gênero. Você consegue hipotetizar os motivos para o podcast ser tão masculino? So, translation, when you presented the image of the difference in the interaction between female and male in the media, I was asking myself of the different appeal that this gender in the media have with women. Can you give us some hypotheses on the motives why the podcast is so masculine?
So should I answer in Portuguese and then translate, or directly in English? What do you think, Lucas?
I think you can go for English.
Yeah.
People have subtitles, closed captions, okay. So people can accompany.
Okay, perfect. Well, that is still something that I need to investigate more. Claudia, thank you for the question. but so I can only raise some things, and I think it would involve also investigating other areas of social communication, behavioral studies, and things of the sort. But one of the things that I mentioned was the fact that for some reason, when podcasts came out, they were basically a male-based form, so that kind of maintained itself. Why hasn't it changed? I would speculate, but they are total speculations at this point. First, maybe the fact that it's still a lot of male voices, and maybe at some point, as we already live in a world, as women, we already live in a world where we are always listening to men telling us what to do and fighting against that. So I'm not sure we want another podcast with another person, another man doing that. That could be one of the things. So the presence of women producing podcasts could maybe change this a little bit more. I guess there is maybe an appeal to, like other media, like Instagram and Facebook, an appeal to the visual, and maybe just the listening factor might not be. And I'm not here thinking in terms of biological differences of women or anything like that, but maybe the fact that historically we've been more adjusted and adapted to visual aids more than just listening. But I don't know. I think it for me, it's a combination of also the topics maybe that are being discussed, or just like this trajectory of not being something that girls were typically encouraged to do. You know, go out there and record a podcast, or but I don't know. I really, these are just hypotheticals. I would have to investigate more and read about it. For the moment, what I have is these numbers, the fact. At least for Brazil, I do not. I need to check this for other countries if that changes, and it's possible that it does. But these numbers for Brazil, they show this marked difference, and I don't know. I think it might be this combination of language, representation, topic. If my friends have suggestions and opinions, I would welcome them.
I'm curious, just to follow up. So the statistics you were looking at were of podcast audiences in Brazil, right? And can you remind me what the split was?
The split revolves, it oscillates a little bit, but it evolves around 65-70% male, 25-30% women.
Okay. All right.
Wow. It's a significant difference.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm very curious. I mean, I don't have much to comment other than to say I'm very curious to see how that plays out internationally.
Yeah, I'm intending to try to find this kind of number for other realities to see if it repeats itself, if it or not. For the moment, I can only talk about Brazil, and for me, one of the most striking differences is exactly in those numbers for the general podcasts between 2018 and 2019. So there is an increase. So women were 18%, if I'm not mistaken, in 2018, and they are now 27%. So there is, it's growing. Would be interesting to see the numbers for last year to see if this is going steadily or not, and then maybe cross this kind of information with maybe the increase of podcasts produced by women. That could be a way also of verifying if this hypothesis about who is doing the podcast affects also who is listening to it.
Thank you, Carol. Yeah, I would like to make some suggestion on that too, on your investigation. It's maybe you could look into when people hear podcasts. What are they doing? Podcast is a kind of format that you're supposed to hear while you're doing something else. and then see if there is any kind of crossing, like people hear podcasts while walking the treadmill. So more men go to gyms to walk on the treadmill, so more men are consuming podcasts. If there is any kind of correlation there, which I think can be the case. I mean, as far as I'm not a consumer on podcasts. At my place, we have an inversion of that. My wife, she hears a lot of podcasts, and I don't. I don't think it's interesting. I try to follow a podcast on a criminal history, but that I got to the point that I was like, oh my God, again, this history, hearing like court transcripts and that kind of stuff. So I was like, I have a boring job. I need something that is really thrilling in a podcast, not something boring in a podcast. So let's go further. We have a question from the YouTube channel. So Leila Rodriguez, who is a professor of medieval history in Rio, we know her, and Paul, I think he doesn't, but now he knows her from name at least. And she is asking, I will again say it in Portuguese and then translate. She's asking, bom dia, parabéns aos colegas. Seria possível comentar em que medida a experiência da história pública pode ser valorizada no processo de ensino, buscando uma relação direta com a sociedade? So Leila is asking, she first congratulates you all, and she's asking if you could comment in which way the public history, the experience with public history could be better in the teaching process, to try to bring up or to construct a better relation and more direct relation to society with history, through public history and teaching history.
I think Carol and I have a little bit of experience because we made our students from Middle Ages courses produce podcasts, videos, such public history products. Like, how can I say that? But yeah. And that was wonderful, I think. Carol, I think you made a speech about it.
Yes, I did at the event from Vivarium. I showed some of the things that my students. There was a podcast and there were Instagram posts that they produced, and it was very interesting because they got involved both in choosing what they were going to do. I gave them the option; they could do podcasts, whatever they wanted. And they also got to choose the topics, and they each went about it in different ways. And one of the groups, they used their personal Instagram page, and they created one of those queries for their users who are not historians to ask, oh, what topic would you like to learn more about? And based on the answers of their followers, they created. Another one chose the topic of the moment, like the Black Death, because of the COVID-19 context. And the group that produced a podcast went into, I think, their own personal identity issues, because they decided to talk about African realities. And so in this case, but I don't know if what Leila is referring to is only specifically because we're working with history undergraduate students. I guess we could, it would be interesting to transpose this to elementary education as well, and high school education. And I think from this experience that I had, and I think given the way that we understand public history today, it has to do with listening to, giving room to the students and listening to them, using the knowledge that they bring. Paul mentioned the public, and in this case, the students. The public is not dumb. The students know things, and they don't just know things that we consider to be wrong. I think it's the wrong way to go about it, is to get the student that comes and says, "Oh, I know that there are damsels and knights," and I just turn to them, "No, this is all wrong." That's not the way to go about it. Yeah? We need to use the knowledge that they bring and transform it, but maybe using what they already bring will get them involved in it, and they can hopefully, I'm remembering something that Professor Utz said in the keynote opening about an experiment that he did with his students, where the students went home and would then tell somebody in their family about a myth that they had debunked in class. And this had a much better effect than when it was the professor talking. So if maybe we can get this involvement of the students with their families, and then we can broaden that into a bigger use in society. We have to believe in this transformative power.
I agree with a lot of that, with so much of that. Particularly, I love how you were bringing up elementary and secondary educations. I'm the only one here who doesn't have students, so I envy you to some degree. But it's something that I've been wanting to do for a long time, of collaborate with teachers and education specialists, and on an equal playing field as well, because they know their craft in the same way that we do. I find that at least when, for example, educators at the Smithsonian work with curators at the Smithsonian, there's often the curators usually have PhDs, the educators usually have MAs. And so there's usually this unequal power relationship that kind of develops, because the curators sort of assume that they know best. And ultimately it means that it produces, when they pull that kind of stuff, it means that they produce stuff that is very academic and very scholarly, and that no one actually cares about. Whereas when it's a much more equal relationship, that is that the ultimate products at the end of the day are much better. So I've been really hoping to be able to work with educators and curriculum developers to help develop more materials for kids that are in 3rd grade, 5th grade, 8th grade, 11th grade, to help reach them as well. Because I've said this for a long time, especially when it comes to these nationalist myths, these abuses of the Middle Ages, that kind of stuff, that if we're only getting them when they're adults, we are far behind. We are waging an uphill battle, where if we're able to catch them when they're younger, and really reach them when they're younger, it's much easier to instill a good groundwork in good history. So.
Thank you. That was Carol said to us about taking what kids know in elementary school or high school, and using that for their education, for their historical education. That's something that it's sitting with me for a long time, because I'm pursuing a second degree now on education, and that's one thing that I was thinking, because I like to play video games. So I play a lot. I play like franchise, like Assassin's Creed and that kind of stuff. And I was sitting playing, and I was thinking, well, it is not a history book, but it is a hook. If my student is hooked on this game, and he's thinking about the French Revolution or about the Vikings now with the last installment of the series. If he's thinking about the Vikings in Britain, why shouldn't I take this game and make something useful with that? This is quite a different discussion about gaming and history and gaming that we should engage in another time. But I believe there is a misunderstanding of many professional historians, academics, that think that there needs to be a clear division between what the public is consuming concerning history and what we are consuming or producing and consuming at the university level. That has to be clearly divided, and it cannot be mixtured. And it's kind of, we know better and we have to make our history go into the game. And then we see that whenever, at least in Brazil, I investigated that a little. All the time when we are talking about gaming the history or something like that, we are talking about, we have to go to the TI department on the data centers of the university and ask them to make a game that is as good as Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed, but is correct, historically correct. And you know, usually when a game comes out that is thought and produced by an historian, it's usually a terrible game, and it is usually also not so good a history. And I advocate that maybe we should play video games and engage with that and say, okay, this is nice thing to, this is a nice product to engage with history. And then the student is hooked. When we get them hooked on historical stuff, then maybe they'll want it more. And then if we don't say that's all bullshit, that's nothing of that is in a history book, but we say, well, you like Assassin's Creed and the Vikings in Britain, take this book and read a little bit more on Vikings in Britain. And then maybe he is going a step further and transitioning from something that he likes, and he begins to like a subject because it is something outside. And from this liking a subject, he can start studying it.
Lucas, can I pick up on something that you said about how then you create these games at the university and they're horrible? Because I think it connects to something we've been talking and Daniele mentioned. And I'm already kind of picking up on the question that I saw Gabriel posting here on the chat, which is the quality of the visual elements as well. One of the reasons why these games, that it's not going to beat Ubisoft, because the visual quality, the technical aspect is so high. And I think when we put into perspective a little bit, Daniele showed Felipe Castanhari's videos, and I'm sure Paul has never seen it, but he has an enormous reach. He even signed a contract with Netflix. So it's a production. It's visually enticing. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's also hard for us to go beyond our how can I say, our specialized public, because even when we are not talking to historians, we're often talking to history students or something of the sort. And I think some part of it has to do with the fact that we are not able to produce content with that level of quality. And I don't think that's a problem, because we don't need to do that. And then to pick up on Gabriel's question about what we study, we don't have that in a history course. And I think it's worth mentioning to Paul that here, differently from the United States, we do, our major is the whole course. You go into the university directly into a major. So a history student will spend 4 years studying basically just history related subjects. It's extremely specialized. So I think, yes, we should be thinking about adding new things like communication, technology, in terms of thinking for public history. But I would say that we also need to be working more collaboratively with other areas. So people that are actually experts in web design, in communication and things like that. That could be a way. It's not easy, but that could be a way. So I just wanted to pick up on that because I was thinking about this, how we can't compete. They have money to do it. We don't. We know that Felipe Castanhari has a team of dozens of people working with him and things like that. So.
Yeah, that's right. We never have $3 billion per year like Ubisoft for doing one game.
Or Netflix and History Channel with us.
Yeah. So let's go for now more questions. I see two more questions. One again from Claudia Bovo. To all participants, we are all at risk of making mistakes and being outdated due to the fast advance of research in medieval studies. How can we be sure to make a good history for and with the public in the face of this difficulty and constant updating? Any clue for it?
I apologize. I'm not sure I fully understood the question. It's about how can public historians cope with the fact that history knowledge is constantly changing and expanding? Or is it? Okay, great. I think that's something that I think that there's this major divide between how the public has been taught to think about history and how historians tend to think about history. And I think that's something that we really need to do better at communicating, in that the public tends to be taught, especially in primary and elementary school, primary and high school, tends to be taught that like history is like what happened. And if you learn what happened, then that's history. And then you're done and you've learned all the history that there is to learn. And as historians, we know that that's not true. We know that history is a process. We know that history is constantly under revision. And so that's where we get into that combative stance with the public sometimes, where we get accused of being revisionist historians, as if that's something that's like a problem. Whereas most historians will look around and go, no, like that's what we do. We revise history. That's why we have jobs. That's the whole thing, right? And so I think embracing that with ourselves in terms of conditionality of everything that we say, in terms of saying like, yes, this is what we believe to be true now, but with an understanding that much in the same way that our understanding of every other subject on earth is going to be different in 30 years from now, the same is going to be different in terms of our understanding and interpretations of the past.
Girls, any ideas?
Well, I guess I just wanted to reinforce what Paul said, because maybe the issue is also changing a little bit how we teach and think of history at the school level. Exactly this. So if we break this idea of fixed history, the fact, the event, and we start to rethink a little bit how we teach children and teenagers to consider history as ever-changing process, methods, etc. And I'm here picking up on yesterday Brian from Denmark talking about how they approach the study of history there, and comparing it a little bit to our educational system that is very content-based. And we basically just repeat from I think around the 3rd, 4th grade, when we start to see history, until the last year of high school, you basically just repeat the same content over and over again, maybe in the expectation that students were just incorporated. But that also has to do with the way that we select people later to go into the university, et cetera, et cetera. But I would say that if we change the way people see history, if we try to bridge more this gap between historians' history and people's history, that also kind of exempts us from the risk of, oh my God, you said something that is outdated or it has changed, because then it's not like you're apologizing for, you didn't make a mistake, you know. The knowledge simply changed because of new resources, new technology, new advances, new interpretations. And then I don't think it's a problem that I post today something about the Crusades, and then next week there's a new video with a completely new approach, and what I said now is outdated. But that's not a problem. I can just simply then do, because this is such a fluid world, that I can then just simply do a new post or whatever and say, oh, look, we now have new evidence to analyze this in a different way. Yeah, I don't know.
Danny, I was starting to speak German. It's because
that will be a little bit more complicated.
I will be more comfortable.
Yeah, Danielle is a German specialist, so well, Gabriel Castanho also asked in the chat, and his question goes in the direction of something that Carolina already spoke about, that we in Brazil do not have a training for our students that go beyond pure history study. We don't go further than learning periods, epochs, and a lot of theory. Actually, when I was studying in Germany, most of my colleagues were quite impressed on how much theory we actually study in Brazil, history theory. At my university, I had 4 semesters of history theory, and after that, another 2 semesters during my master's degree. So I had a total of 6 semesters of history theory, and only 2 semesters of medieval history. So, so Gabriel is asking, what are your take on this issue? Is there anything to do besides destroying the Ministry of Education and starting everything from ground?
That's actually a good idea.
I mean, we are dealing with that. All universities in Brazil now are facing the quick change on educational legislation for higher education in Brazil. In the past, I don't know, 5 years, we had like 3 major changes in the higher education legislation in Brazil, and we still are doing our higher education as we do schools. So we have a lot of classes, much more than any university around the world. We have much more classes than anybody, and they still try to bring a lot of influences from like the Bologna system into Brazil. Like you have not just have like 3,000 hours of classes for your course, but another 300 hours of other programs, and that and that and that. So I don't know if Paul has anything to say about this very specific Brazilian problem, but I would extend this question to Carolina and Daniele. If you have any ideas how to improve exchange between historians and other knowledge directions like media, communication, informatics, and so on for Brazil. And Paul could have some input on what's your experience on that kind of exchange in the US.
Well, we have transversal, can I say that? Transversal disciplines. That means gender, race, and such things in our curricula, but we don't have media as a transversal theme. We can work it together with the students because they know how to do things on internet, or they know how to write a blog, etc. But a transversal discipline should be the ideal, but ideal, it's not actually useful. I don't know. It's difficult.
Yeah, it's just, well, I had mentioned already before, but and again, I think it comes with rethinking the curricula as well. I know many courses are going through and go through processes of rethinking their curricula, and an alternative would be to try to think, for example, the place of public history within the formation of the historian or history teacher that we are offering. It has other complicated implications, financially speaking, because we would need specialized professors, and then we don't have the money to necessarily hire them. But I guess this would be like the ideal. The other path would be that each professor inserts this in some way, using the knowledge that each one has, or using the students, as Daniele said, to, like, little by little insert this into the practice and the study. But for the moment, I think that's what we have. I believe that most people in Brazil today that are doing or attempting to do anything related to public history, and that's not just in medieval, any aspect, they're pretty much kind of self-taught. It's people that are reading and studying and trying, then contacting other people, but we don't have anything, as for example, in the US, I know you have degrees in public history. We have nothing similar to that here. So it's much more complicated.
Well, if you want me to come found a degree in public history in Brazil, I'd be more than happy to. Although maybe wait a few years, government, whatever. Yeah, and I guess talking about, not being a part of traditional academia, I can't really talk about like how academics can partner with media organizations or things like that, at least not on a big scale, aside from saying that there need to be real incentives for them to do so. Because right now, at least in the United States, there's an awful lot of disincentives from people actually doing public history work. I get all the time people saying about the Public Medievalist, oh, I'd love to write for you, but I've got this book, this article, all this other stuff that I have to prioritize. And it's not that I'm paying them any less than they're getting paid to write that journal article, because we're both paying zero. It's that they are getting paid in terms of clout in the community, in terms of tenure, promotion, all of that stuff. Whereas writing for somebody like me doesn't get you nothing. Same with working for and with like Ubisoft, for example, if Ubisoft came knocking tomorrow and said, hey, we want you to be a historical advisor for our next great Assassin's Creed game, I know that there are a lot of academics who would look at that and go, is this going to actually be a problem for my career? Which is one of the reasons why I think so many academics who do work on projects with Hollywood or with video gamers, or sorry, with video game designers, ultimately end up disavowing themselves, asking that their names be taken off of it because it was so awful and the end product was so different from what they recommended. Which sort of goes back to our discussion about video games. And to some degree, I guess I have to respect that. And in other ways, it again goes back to what I was talking about with the power differential between curators and educators, right? Where the curators want to throw their weight around because they're the ones who have the PhD, but ultimately it ends up in having it be a worse product. I think that there's probably a similar idea that might be going on behind the scenes when academics often work with media companies to try where they expect that their expertise is going to be respected to the degree where what they say goes, but they are not the ones with the power in this. And if anything, it's the other way, that and that academics are very much not accustomed to being in a position where they don't have the last say on something that they're contributing to. And so I think that can lead to a lot of bad blood in the end, which results in a lot of this. But also it is difficult to even get into the beehive of public history, the public history world, and especially if you're doing something that is different, that isn't just yet another retelling of the Arthurian legends or the Templars or something that is sort of tried and true, right? To give you an example, I actually have started doing public lectures for the Smithsonian on medieval history, which I'm pretty pleased with, working with one of the Smithsonian branches to do so. And it's great fun, but I proposed a number of topics to them when I first started working with them. And the ones they chose for me to do first were by far the least controversial. They were like the Middle Ages in popular culture and like all the things about the Middle Ages you never knew kind of stuff, which was, fine. But all the stuff that I wanted to talk about race and gender and things like that, they were like, no, I don't know about that. But since I've done 2 lectures now and have had huge attendance at both lectures, and I've managed to prove myself with that, the people at the Smithsonian have now turned around and they said, you want to do that race thing? And so now that I have just that little bit of credibility with them to understand that I can deliver and that I'm not, that they're allowing me a little bit more freedom to do what I want, a little bit like a director maybe who has to make the big Hollywood blockbuster before they can then go on to make like their personal passion project, same sort of thing. That having been said, I've put together a number of pitches for documentaries for various film companies, and I've pitched documentaries to a bunch of them, and none of them have ever been taken up. So I may not be the best expert on that either. It's a conundrum. I don't know.
Okay, thank you very much. The same time that the said book was published. So it's just a coincidence. Well, well, if you allow me, I would actually use the last 5 minutes to talk to Carol, actually, to provoke a little discussions, and Danny and Paul can mixed in this discussion. But when Carol was talking about women in history, and there is a huge thing going on with women in history, women in medieval history is growing exponentially, this search for the women in medieval history, because we had this tradition of talking of medieval history as history, the history of man. George Duby had his book of the Middle Ages, the Age of Man. So one very, very famous case is the Viking warrior women grave, the BJ 581, which caused some uproar in 2017 when it was first published that it was a Viking warrior woman. And by that time, we had a split in academia on whether we should go by the Viking warrior women or we should try to explain that in other terms. And there was something that caught my attention on this whole discussion was that one leading scholar on women and Viking women in the Viking age, it was Judith Jesch. And she was writing a piece. I don't remember where. It was something public, like a paper or something like that, on a journal. And she was kind of cancelled by the public because public wanted. She was like, we have to be careful in drawing conclusions so fast on the case, because we are assuming that this is the remains of the Lagertha of the series, of the Viking series, of kind of that stuff. And she was saying that the question is much more complex. We have to understand what it means to bury someone with armor and swords and spears and horses in the Viking age. And it's not to assume that it was someone that was present in a battle, but maybe it was someone that was responsible for an army or something like that. It was a leader, but not necessarily a warrior in a sense, in a vulgar sense of someone that was killed in battle or something like that. I didn't follow up what was going on after that, and if the positions change. I think since 2017, when it first came out, there had been a lot of following publications on this specific grave, and it is kind of solidified the idea that it was a warrior woman. And so my question to Carolina is actually, what should we do in such situations when modern interests become so strong that it can actually obscure some nuances of the historical investigation?
Well, that's a very good question and a difficult one, because I think deep down we can never get rid of our modern assumptions. I think it was Dani who said at some point, yeah, history is political. It has always been. The fact that we advocate today for gender history, or whatever you want to call it, has to do with political movements. The same thing goes for studying race, and there's a big discussion about whether there is or there isn't a notion of race and racism for the Middle Ages, for example. And we can go about the anachronisms or things like that. But in this case, yeah, as far as I know, this is where the discussion is, right? I think one of the issues regarding women in gender relations is that we need to try to stop looking for gender models of what is a woman's or a man's behavior when we look into the past. And we need to stop looking at women and understanding women's agency or any kind of power as having to necessarily correspond to male models of agency and power. And I think sometimes that's what's at play when you see this the so-called Viking woman warrior. And this becomes like, oh, look, women were actually going to battle. Is that a good thing? First of all, no. And why is it that in order to validate women's actions in society, we need to associate her to a warrior role? So in fact, I think there are two things happening. One is that we are analyzing using our own gender biases many times, even when we don't realize it. And second is that even when we don't overtly admit it, we still think that certain things represent power and others don't. So we dismiss, for example, women's actions in the homes. And I'm not going to say that throughout most of the Middle Ages. Yes, that's where most women were. They were not so, there were women acting in public power, etc., but many of them were in the home. And that doesn't mean that they are inferior in any way, but it means that we consider that an inferior role. So I think what we need to do is actually invert and start first questioning what it is that we're looking for when we look at gender roles in the past. Stop trying to fit women into male gender roles, and even question if the male roles that we are attributing are actually correct ones or not. So I think it's something in this sense.
Thank you, Carol. Paul or Daniele, do you want to say something about that as our last contribution, because we are getting to the point when we have to close the session?
I guess I'll jump in, and yeah, I think a lot of what I'm thinking in this is connecting to some of the bigger questions that we've talked about over the past couple of hours, which is who is the audience and who is history for? I think one of the reasons, I think as scholars, we can look at the public's interpretation of that, or journalists' interpretation of that as you know, definitive proof of the Lagatha of in history. And we can sort of tut and shake our heads and we should, because Carolina's right, you know, about everything that she said. I think that we should look a little more carefully at why this idea is so powerful for people, why this idea is so meaningful for people. And I think that is partially because history as a discipline and public history has assumed that its core audience is white male hetero, has assumed that the people who care most about history are you know, upper middle class dads, effectively, and that is who history is about, and that is who history is for. And I think one of the reasons why people got so excited about that is because it is part of complicating that narrative. It's part of saying that history which is so focused on violence, history can include women in that violence. Whether that's accurate or not, that idea is a powerful one, particularly for contemporary conversations about women in contemporary militaries as well. And so you can see why, even like Andrew Elliott was saying, even though it's an inaccurate history, it is a useful one, that it is one that people can latch onto and find themselves in and pour themselves into. And that's why it's so compelling. So I think that we need to tread a little carefully when we are pushing back against those ideas, to try to find ways to still say that history is by, for, about women, while at the same time talking about deconstructing gender roles and deconstructing ideas of gender that we have that lead us to these assumptions about who was and wasn't a warrior, and how this applies to our contemporary society. So.
Thank you very much. Well, I believe we have to close the session, unfortunately. There was a lot of other questions that I believe people would like to make to you and that we should discuss, but I believe that is going to have to wait for the second conference on medievalism, new medievalism. Okay, I would leave the floor for Luis to close the work here today, and thank you all the participants, the public here at Zoom and on YouTube, and see you soon.
Well, thank you, Lucas, and well, thank you, Carol, Dani, and Paul for joining us, from connecting to us from the US and from other places of Brazil as well. This was an amazing discussion. It's a shame we need to end it now, but we're already 5 minutes late and we only have half an hour for lunch. So yeah, there is that. And just promoting our own conference, we have after lunch, so half an hour from now, Hollywoodian Medievalisms, our panel 9, and I hope to see you all there. Thank you very much.